Chapter 395, Practicing Sword Techniques. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. The second round of testing was 3 days long. All of the students were required to stay in the Saint Academy and perceive sword techniques. Only after the test was complete were they allowed to leave. 2 days' time passed very quickly. Xihai had his hands behind his back and his eyes were cold and sharp. He surveyed the examination field and asked Ni Wenlong, "Which move has Xikanglan reached?" Ni Wenlong's expression was very respectful and he said, in reply to elder brother, "The 8th move." Xihai nodded with satisfaction and said, "Xikanglan is the second master of this generation from Saint Xu Gentry. His sword technique attainment is very high and should have reached the peak of the sword following the heart realm a long time ago." 7 days ahead of time, I had gotten the cultivation method for the 13 swords techniques of soul chasing from the master and gave it to him. He indeed has not let me down. The 8th sword, that is very good. The person hosting the second round of the tests of the sword technique department was Xihai's master, Demi Saint Linyuan. The 13 swords technique of soul chasing was a sword technique developed by Demi Saint Linyuan 7 days ago. As a genius of Saint Xu Gentry, as well as a disciple of Demi Saint Linyuan, 7 days ago he had received the cultivation method for the 13 swords techniques of soul chasing and had given it to the second genius of this generation in Saint Xu Gentry, Xikanglan. That is to say, before the start of the Saint Academy's examination, Xikanglan had already had 7 days to perceive the cultivation method, and was just about finished studying the 13 swords techniques of soul chasing. Now, he just had to practice the sword movements to merge them and the cultivation method into one, and then he would have succeeded in practicing this sword technique. Having spent 2 days on them, Xikanglan had already successfully practiced 7 moves and was now just beginning the 8th. There is still 1 day left. Xikanglan should be able to successfully practice the 10th move. The sword heart pill is already in my pocket. Thinking of this, a slight curve appeared at the corner of Xihai's mouth. The reason that he told Xikanglan of the cultivation method of 13 swords techniques of soul chasing early was because he wanted Xikanglan to win first place in the second round of the examination and help him win the sword heart pill. 20 years ago, Xihai had reached the peak of the sword following the heart realm, and his cultivation of sword techniques became deeper and deeper, but he just could not converge the heart of the sword. Thus, he had to obtain the sword heart pill and break into the heart integrated into sword realm. And after tomorrow, the sword heart pill was his. Ni Wenlong stared in Zhang Ruochen's direction and said, "Elder brother Xihai, Zhang Ruochen is in the heart integrated into sword realm. His sword technique practice is probably very fast. I think he will become a strong opponent of Xikanglan." Xihai gave a cold sneer and showed a disdainful expression. So what if his realm is high? It's only a total of 3 days, and he is just a mortal and not a saint, so how could he practice a sword technique successfully so quickly? Don't you see? He is still perceiving the cultivation method and hasn't started sword practice. Practicing sword techniques was split into 2 parts. Perceiving the cultivation method, and practicing the sword movements. The cultivation method included the coordination of the footwork, the running of the genuine qi, and the key secret of the sword technique. Only after clearly perceiving these 3 things could one start practicing the sword movements. The purpose of practicing the sword movements was so that the sword technique, their warrior, the footwork, and the running of the genuine qi in their warrior's body could meld into one being. The sword technique and the warrior became one whole body and reached the point of doing as one wished. When one struck, there was no need for thought. The sword technique had already been executed and killed those who were under your sword. For example, Zhang Ruochen had practiced some sword techniques in his previous life. Arriving in this life, he had to practice again so that the sword techniques could meld into one with this body and reach the realm of following the heart, or even integrating. In other words, practicing the sword technique until it was part of the body just like the hands, feet, eyes, and nose. Only then was it the realm of following the heart. Practicing the sword technique until the flesh of the body melded with the soul. Only then was that considered the realm of heart integrated into sword. If that point was not reached, then your practice would always only have the shape of the sword movement and you could only be considered a rash man, and would not be able to become a swordsman. Just as Xihai's words finished, suddenly, Zhang Yuochen, who had been sitting cross-legged, began to practice the sword movements. Zhang Yuochen used his hand as a sword and pointed outward. Then shortly after, 7 shadowy streaks of his hand appeared and split apart, like a heavenly girl scattering flowers, and flew towards 7 points in the void space. Crack, crack, 7 chi explosions resounded in a row, just like the sound of 7 sword tips hitting against a stone wall. Elder brother Xihai, Zhang Yuochen has already begun to the practice of sword movements. He just demonstrated the first sword of the 13 swords techniques of soul chasing, haunting septuple kill, Ni Wenlong said. Xihai's expression darkened and he immediately turned around and gazed at Zhang Yuochen. It was already the last day, and not only Zhang Yuochen, but the other students were also rising and beginning their practice of sword movements. After Zhang Yuochen had executed the first move, he became like a stone again, sitting cross-legged on the ground. He did not move and did not continue practicing any movements. I never knew that, after reaching the realm of heart integrated into sword, one would only need to thoroughly perceive the cultivation method and then one could use the heart of the sword and complete the practice of sword movements in one's mind. Furthermore, it could reach the realm of success. Earlier, Zhang Yuochen had been practicing the move haunting septuple kill in his mind. When he had tried it just now, it had indeed succeeded. Zhang Yuochen continued to enjoy this marvelous realm. In his chi-si, the heart of the sword dissolved into a human shape and began to practice the second move, soul-breaking wind whisper. In the distance, Ni Wenlong saw Zhang Yuochen not moving at all and furrowed his brows. What is that guy doing? He only demonstrated one move and then he doesn't move again. There is only this last day left. Is he not going to start practicing the sword movements? Xihai smiled coldly and said, ignore him, he probably thinks too highly of himself and wants to thoroughly perceive all 13 cultivation methods of the sword technique before starting to practice the moves. It is a pity, there is not that much time left for him. They had not reached the heart integrated into sword, so, of course, they did not understand the marvels of the heart integrated into sword. They had no idea that Zhang Yuochen had long thoroughly perceived all 13 moves of the sword technique and was now already practicing the moves in his mind. In the other direction, Xikanglan of Saint Xu Gentry had already successfully practiced the 8th move and had begun the 9th. How is that student from Saint Xu Gentry so powerful? He's already successfully practiced 8 moves. Is he that talented? Juan Xingling was very unhappy. Her round eyes stared closely in the direction of Xikanglan. At the stairway to heaven, Juan Xingling had fought against Xikanglan and did feel that he was particularly powerful. At least, if she released her sealed cultivation, she absolutely could have crossed 2 realms and defeated Xikanglan. However, right now, she had already put all her power into perceiving the 13 swords techniques of soul chasing and had only succeeded to 7 swords. Did a genius student from Saint Xu Gentry have more comprehension ability than she did? A heretical saintness? There must be a problem. I don't believe his comprehension ability is really that high. Juan Xingling was very unhappy and continued to perceive the sword technique with all her power, trying to surpass Xikanglan. If he surpassed her, that would be so embarrassing. The 3 days finally ended. On this day, the main examiner, Demi Saint Lin, personally visited and sat in the highest position. Beside Demi Saint Lin, there hovered a jade lotus platform. The 3-inch-tall Demi Saint Lingxiu sat cross-legged on the platform. She wore an outfit of red and carried a sword. Her body was hidden behind a swirl of white fog, like an immortal from another world. Although Demi Saint Lingxiu was not very old, she was the disciple of Headmaster Xuanji. Her position in the Saint Academy was above that of Demi Saint Lin. Even Demi Saint Lin treated with her great respect and did not dare to slight her. All of the students who had registered for the sword technique department ascended the martial arts platform and tried their best to demonstrate the sword technique that they had perceived, attempting to show their most outstanding condition. If they could be favored by a half-saint and became a descendant, that would be reaching the heavens in one step. The first student to ascend the martial arts platform was a young girl. Her cultivation was at the initial stage of the heaven realm. Haunting septuple kill, soul-breaking wind whisper, soul repose shadowing. The girl tried to demonstrate the 4th move but failed and retreated. However, Successfully practicing 3 techniques was a minimal pass, so she passed the second round of the examinations. The second student to mount the martial arts platform had a cultivation that reached the dawn state of the heaven realm. He was considered a first-class superior among the students who were participating in the Saint Academy's examination. However, he failed. He barely managed to successfully practice 2 sword techniques and was not able to enter the Saint Academy in the end. To be able to reach the dawn state of the heaven realm before he was 35. His talent is already very high. It is a pity that his comprehension ability of sword techniques is so lacking and has not reached the standards to be a student at the Saint Academy. Many people felt regret for him, but at the same time, they sighed with feeling. The threshold for the Saint Academy was very high. Even ace geniuses might be turned away. Over the following tests, at least 70% of the students were able to demonstrate 3 moves of the sword technique and pass the exam. 20% of the students were only able to demonstrate 2 moves of the sword technique, and less than 10% were only able to demonstrate 1 of the moves of the sword technique. Among them, there were 3 to 5 people who could not even demonstrate 1 move. However, even so, it was clear that the students who had participated in the Saint Academy examination were all of a very high quality, and all were aces from the cream of the crop. If a warrior with a normal talent in the heaven realm were asked to practice such a deep sword martial technique like the 13 swords technique of soul chasing, never mind in 3 days, even if they were given 30 days, they still might not be able to successfully practice even 1 move from that technique. Through the sword practice, it was also possible to see the different levels of the students' comprehension abilities. There were almost 1,000 students practicing sword techniques here, and about 700 of them were able to practice 3 moves of the sword technique. About 80 people were able to practice 4 moves, and only 10 were able to practice 5 moves. There was not a single person who could do 6 moves. Only one descendant of a saint from a powerful family was able to practice 7 moves, which was the most outstanding result. Someone actually practiced 7 moves of the sword technique. I never knew that among those powerful saint families there were geniuses with such high comprehension abilities. Juan Muxingling glanced toward Huang Yanjun and said, "Sister Chen, how many moves have you practiced successfully?" 5 moves, Huang Yanjun said. In terms of comprehension ability, Huang Yanjun could only be considered at the peak, but had not reached the incredible level. To perceive 7 moves in just 3 days, that was an incredible skill. Even in the eyes of the half-saints, it was a very good result. To be continued.